Okay, so here we go. Luciana, I'll introduce you once again very briefly. Welcome to CXO Collective, everyone. Our guest today is Luciana Simone. I've known Luciana for more than 2 years now. We met first at the TEDx Claremont event, and I've always inspired by her insights, her teachings around the legal aspects that she brings expertise, and also at leadership. She is a part of Claremont Graduate School's Leadership Institute as well. So I think quite a breadth of experience that it would be a fascinating conversation to talk to someone and glean insights around AI governance from someone who is coming from such a broad perspective and really give us what does it mean for someone who can talk at the intersection of all those 3 or 4 core specializations. So without any further ado, I want to give it over to Luciana. Luciana, the first question I have for you is, you have a lot of legal experience. I think you are a trained lawyer and you also teach at Thomas Jefferson Law School. So I would start with a question which is very pressing in boards and regulators' mind right now as we speak. How are the two major economic blocs, European Union and US, approaching the topic of AI governance, AI ethics, AI regulations? Because the legal systems are different. The legal laws that are in place with EU AI Act and American systems do not have a penalty. So how are these two systems approaching AI governance? If someone is a board member, what should they be really thinking about? And if they're launching their products across Atlantic, what are key concerns they should keep in mind?
Yeah, hi Ron. Thanks first of all for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to discuss about this topic with you. So I would say that artificial intelligence governance now is converging on a shared global objective that's like safety, fairness, accountability. But the United States and the European Union are traveling very, very different regulatory paths to reach this goal. So I would say that the sharpest contrast between the two systems emerge in 4 areas, and one of them is the regulatory architecture. European has a single uniform statute with like six timelines, and we know like last year, 2024, the European AI Act was adopted, and as opposed to the European system, the US has a mosaic of executive action, agency enforcement, state law levels, right? So the mosaic, that picture is very, very fragmented, but it's getting very nicely together. Second, I would say that obligations on foundational models diverge as well. So the EU imposes clear duties and deadlines on general purposes and systemic risk models, while the US has no model cost statute and is basically relies on standards, on contracts, and mostly on case-by-case enforcement. And then there are enforcement and penalties that are pretty distinct. And here I would say that in Europe there's more predictability because you have administrative fines up to like, for example, 7% of global turnover or like 35 million euros penalty, which is a lot, of course.
Yeah.
While the US exposure arises to agency actions, litigation, settlements, and that can vary case by case, right? And then there's another difference, I would say, in the rights orientation. I would say that Europe is grounded more in fundamental rights and product safety laws, while the US focuses on consumer protection, anti-discrimination, and moral innovation. So mostly these are fostered through voluntary standards. So if it would be from a board and council perspective, I would say that a practical recommendation would be to build to the higher form, right? Adopt the EU classification, documentation, monitoring process as global defaults, provide a very defensible compliance posture across jurisdictions. But then I would say that the US system is also very useful. It encourages anchoring more in things like consumer transparency or so I think it's more grounded in the human aspect of AI governance. So basically, we should be ready to tackle mostly free, of course, and for global outreach. Maybe we should convey these positions, right, to survive all the European inspections and also being ready to comply with U.S. agency in Korean litigation.
Exactly. We don't. I think these are critical differences. One starts with enforcement first. The other one is more innovation focused, the U.S. model. And with the new administration largely focused on innovation, guardrails and governance, taking a little bit of a backseat, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
So I really want to double click on that and say, suppose you're a board member or someone who is advising the executive committee at a large Fortune 500. What would you advise these companies should do to scale across Atlantic? For instance, if they start adopting their baseline as EU baseline model, of course, they will be left behind on the innovation because regulation and innovation sometimes don't go hand in hand. Vis-a-vis, if they really go with the American pace of innovation, which is extremely fast and it's quite impressive, quite frankly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pace of change is the slowest it has been in a long time. How does it really scale out into European and even other fragmented regulatory markets? You have their own, but now you have China coming up with their own set of regulations, and Asia Pacific have their own. Singapore very famously have their own AI governance standards. So with such regulatory fragmentation, how do you think boards should really approach scaling? And what are key questions they should ask their risk committees and their chief executives to keep in mind?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I'm sure it often comes up in boardrooms and policy circles as well. And I would say because we don't have a clear system in either of these regions, I would say like take what's the best from each of them. Try to, as much as possible, get those higher standards in both uh, all regions that you are activating with. It's very important to do your research. It's very important to know our blind spots, right? Mostly when it comes to workplace and AI deployment. We have employment and anti-discrimination exposure, right? So many employers we work with people, workforce talent from abroad, right? Don't realize that the moment they use AI in recruiting, for example, or promotion or performance management, they are squarely within existing employment law, right? So you have to be aware of the laws that apply wherever your operations are, right? Either it's domestic or abroad or a combination of both. So that is really, really important. Make sure that you know your blind spot. Then I would say, of course, you need to be able to comply, right, with domestic and also if you're operating abroad with international laws. But also make sure that you don't defer due diligence to other actors. And here I would talk about vendors, contractors from another country. This is something that we might be prone to, and it's a pitfall because many organizations assume that if a vendor markets an AI solution as compliant or bias free, that shifts responsibility, right? And legally, it does not, regardless of the fact that you're like relying on a domestic partner or an international partner. And regulators in both the US and EU expect that the deployer, right, so the company using the tool, will demonstrate oversight. And too often I see companies fail to demand audit rights, transparency to training data, or documentation of model updates. So the blind spot is compliance can be outsourced when in fact due diligence, contracts, and ongoing monitoring is essential and it's your duty as a company. What else? I've seen like, okay, the regulatory system policies are really important to be well known, like hire people who really know how to advise you on compliance and risk mitigation. But then I would also say that even if you are compliant, technically compliant, right, sometimes you might overlook how employees experience the system, right? And we
Yes.
know uh, people from one culture, one country might experience the system in a way. If you're a multinational company, or people abroad will experience or might experience it differently. And if workers don't know when AI is being used or how decisions are made or how to appeal, that will erode trust and then legal risk will grow, right?
100%.
So these are some key things
Yes.
that boardroom should focus on right now.
100%. You brought up some very good points, and particularly the one around don't outsource your AI guardrails over to third party vendors. That's an extremely crucial point. And
Make
also
sure
explainability.
yeah,
Exactly.
make sure you're
And
overseeing what's happening.
exactly. Exactly. And explainability and transparency is table stakes when you're deploying. I wanted to take a segue into the next question around your expertise. And probably you can answer this question than probably 99% of people on this planet, because that's your specialization around how AI is affecting employment decisions, employee experience, and customer experience. I think that's the area of your research as well. So I want to double click on that, and I want to take some perspectives. What are you observing are key challenges that we are facing in terms of hiring, layoffs, performance evaluation with the AI systems without much guardrails and explainability around how those are happening? So that's number one. And how widespread is it that you are seeing this adoption of these AI systems in these crucial practices? These are employment, healthcare, civic society systems like policing and legal justice. These are so crucial systems that we need to be extra conscious around bias, transparency, explainability, and trust aspects of AI. So how widespread do you think adoption is for these systems, for these particular practices? And then what do you think is the minimum viable due process rights for employees if they have been subject to some of these discrimination?
Yeah. I think I'm seeing like AI tools used uh very widely. So more and more companies are adopting uh, artificial intelligence based or powered applications to hire, to select, recruit, select, and then of course hire their talent, which is great, right? It's very efficient. It's very quickly. It's very cheap as opposed to doing it through human research. However, I feel like there's gap there where we forget that although artificial intelligence is a technological importance, technological upgrade, it is also social and psychological disruption, right? So it challenges how decisions are made, how people experience fairness now, and also like in terms of like retaining talent, what motivates them to engage, to contribute, and stay within a company. And more we're hearing about cases where recruitment tools demonstrated bias. And that's a huge problem because it leads, of course, to discrimination. And that's why I was pointing earlier to this. It's really, really important. Okay, it's trying to work with AI companies who promise like safe and very fast recruiting process. But it's also very, very important to do your research. It's part of your due diligence. You have to make sure that when you're using algorithms, right, in the workplace, like when you're hiring, when you're scheduling, when if you're servicing clients, right, or you're trying to recover from a service failure, or even you're making like strategic decisions, you have to make sure that you ensure enough transparency because fairness now it's experienced in a new way, right? Those foundations of all these practices are tested and challenged in new ways. And we need to prepare and make sure that our system and our people are ready for this transition, right? So I would say that, okay, the technical part is important, regulatory aspect is also very important, but also the social contract inside organizations is very important as well because as I mentioned, trust and fairness and motivation are very fragile resources. And I would say that leaders need to be trained to understand that we must treat trust, fairness, motivation deliberately as we treat financial or technical capital. So I would say that, of course, we're like, it's all the discussion about bias and how we can reduce bias since it's embedded already in the data that we're working on. And we're making progress, right? We see more and more cases and cases raise awareness. And then, of course, we're taking measures to make sure that it's less and less bias. But again, make sure that you know your blind spots because regardless, there will always be some type of challenge that we need to be able to address as knowledge, as me. and also clarify how we address eventual.
It was exactly. Well, that's a great point. Again, change management, training, and relaying your vision again and again to your employees is extremely crucial. And that has been Achilles' heels for corporate America for forever, because it's never really the technology that's the culprit. It's you, the culture, and the change management aspect. So that's an excellent point. And this transformation is no different. The tools are much faster, much powerful, much more efficient, but the challenges are still grounded in human technology integration, relaying out your vision, and bringing people together. That's the true job of a leader. So that's a great point, Luciana.
I can embed justice into design and making
Exactly.
trust repair a daily practice. We are afraid to admit that we're wrong, right? Or we did something wrong, or maybe we didn't show something as we were supposed to. And another thing is like redesign job to enhance, not to erode motivation. I think that is really, really
Exactly. Spot on. Thanks for that. So I want to take sort of a detour and ask something which I think you can give a very unique perspective on, because you have such a breadth of experience. You have a breadth of leadership experience, not only organizing TED events, but also as being a part of the Claremont Graduate University Leadership Institute. You also teach business graduates, students, Cal State San Marcos, also teach law, and your diverse educational training, I think, puts you in a unique spot to answer this question. What does responsible AI, or some version of this term, which is very nuanced, quite frankly, right?
cool.
If you throw around these terms to boardrooms like responsible AI or trustworthy AI or ethical AI, I think people understand what broadly does it mean, but they don't understand the gist of what we are trying to say. So, what does someone who comes from an intersection of legal, psychology, analytics, academia, and leaderships, how would you explain to board leaders and policy makers what does these concepts mean? Because these are abstract concepts. We use them, we throw them quite often, but no one truly resonate with them. So, give us your perspective. What do you think these mean, essentially?
Yeah, that is a really good and complex question at the same time. And it's interesting because when people ask me what it means to bring law, analytics, and psychology together, leadership as well together, and AI governance, I usually joke that it feels like translating at a dinner where no one speaks the same language. And that's the real work, and I would say the real opportunity where we should try to connect all these perspectives instead of letting them operate in silos. But it's still very hard because ethical leadership in the legal field might feel a little bit different than ethical or ethical AI governance in marketing or in business, for example, right? I'm teaching marketing classes, business classes as well. So it's very hard to provide a global definition that would apply broadly across domains. But I would say like the core of ethical, responsible AI governance or application would rely upon making sure that we don't lose that human perspective from sight. We are so excited about technological innovation. We are so excited about making our life more efficient. Everything should be quicker. Everything should be very accurate. But let's don't forget about people because we're trying to make sure that AI becomes something that actually empowers human capital, not necessarily makes everything more challenging, although it's speedy, it's effective. It, some people might struggle to adapt to basic changes. So I would say that let's make sure that AI doesn't become a threat and becomes more of a force multiplier for both performance and legitimacy. Because once we're focused on just the technological aspect, just the performance aspect, we might lose legitimacy as an organization. So yeah, just take into account intersectionality, right? Take into account diversity, take into account things that historically, right, might have been challenging for certain categories of people. So make sure to take into account that human aspect, and I would say involve, get as much as possible insights from humans when developing AI so that basically it becomes a tool for people working in the benefit of the people.
Well, very well put. And I 100% agree with that. I think all these terms essentially boil down to the transparency, the bias, the privacy, the security, all the aspects that we have been so far working towards in traditional software to make sure protected classes are not affected by. We want to make sure that those principles are also implemented in AI systems, because these AI systems literally X a wrong thing, because that's how AI works. If you train something on a bad data, you're not getting 1x bad day output. You're getting 100x bad output because it fundamentally multiplies that. So we got to be very careful. It's transferable, it's explainable, it's without bias, it's trustworthy. We are having right guardrails and evaluations so that it's responsibly deployed and it doesn't affect the society, particularly the protected and marginalized classes. So that's really helpful to know. I want to double click on something because you come from academia. You work in the industry and also teach and have a diverse array of experience. You're in a unique spot to answer private partnerships. Right? This is something that I've exploring personally for a long time, and I want to really get a perspective around what's going around the public-private partnership space to address these challenges around responsible ethical adoption. Because as we know, private players can bring innovation, but they can't bring the regulatory guardrails, which only governments can do, and institutions which are empowered to do. They can't bring the cutting edge research, which academia can bring in. They can bring in the feedback loops that civic society can bring in. So what are you observing are the challenges right now and opportunities for public-private partnership around AI governance, responsible adoption of AI, and ethically adopting AI? What are your observations that you were? I mean, is it really becoming table stakes conversations right now, or is it something really a far-fetched, not really on the top of the board agenda list at this point?
See that I'm noticing more and more partnerships, public and private partnerships, which is great because I feel like the public sector, we kind of tended to lag a little bit and fall behind now, started to catch up. And I'm seeing a lot of interest mostly in the academia, for example, education sector, where, for example, I'm teaching for Cal State San Marcos, which is part of the Cal State system at the large. And Cal State recently became a pioneer in adopting AI, and we have a huge investment in AI private partnerships where we are implementing basically artificial intelligence in all spectrums of the educational process, which is great. And I've seen lots of discussions around it more and more. There are, of course, opinions where like we need even more discussions. There are voices which were not taken into account, and I can resonate with that. But I think there is discussion going on, which is really important, and I'm seeing this happening more now than in previous years. And I think that the future of AI governance really depends on this smart public private partnership. I think it's really, really important because governments alone or public agencies alone can keep pace with the speed of technological change. And also companies alone can set the guardrails, right, as I said before, that keep their products legitimacy in a society. From an academia and more from a scholar perspective, I noticed a lot of research, a lot of webinars, a lot of professional conferences around AI governance in the past 2 years, for example. A lot more than before, which it feels great because academia seems to now be more interested in the field and providing, generating, first of all, more knowledge which basically fuels these public and private partnerships. So I think we're going in the right direction as long as we have discussions, open discussions, as long as we bring diverse perspectives. It was challenging for me, for example, to kind of mix very interested in organizational justice, ethics, but at the same time, I'm passionate about marketing. And I wanted to join organizational justice, mostly around fairness, marketing, and AI. And everyone was like, why would you do that? Well, I think it's very important, very, very important to bridge perspectives. And the same thing that I was talking about, I see more perspectives from the public, from the private academia spaces, which I think is a really great thing to have right now.
Yeah, one sector cannot solve all the problems, and quite frankly,
Exactly.
the private sector is much more invested in the profit vector, while governments are more interested in the civil benefit because they have that agenda, right? So none
And
of
there are
them owns.
issues. We have
Yeah,
to
and they're at
remember
odds
that with the
essentially, right? One of
issues,
them has a
but
profit mandate, the other one has a public a good mandate, and both do not have the research capabilities which our top institutions can do. And of course, civil society needs to be a part of the dialogue as well. Otherwise, we will have a resistance to adopting these systems as they scale if the disparities continue, right? So I think public-private
definitely.
partnership is a key aspect. And I wanted to get that perspective around what's the dialogue around that you're observing, because you're in a unique position around academia and some committees where
Yeah,
these dialogues happen.
we have, for example, at CalState, we have a new AI task force focusing on implementing AI at scale in the educational field. As part of the CAPE committee within SciUp, we are also very active in coming up with practical guides for practitioners in the psychology field, but also for leaders at large. So we are in this case committee. We have subcommittees focusing on one of them is this subcommittee focusing on AI. And we have people from corporate level, we have people from academia, we have people from the public sector as well. So I see more and more this type of partnerships where people come, conduct research, conduct
Backgrounds.
surveys, and try to solve real world problems. And I
That
also came across recently upon a very nice initiative by the European Commission where they launched consultations to develop guidelines and code of practice on transparent AI systems. And what I love that this initiative and why I'm bring this into discussion is because they're inviting everyone to contribute. So even regular people, maybe professors, doctors, healthcare specialists, right? Everyone is invited to provide insight, which I think is a really great thing to do.
Exactly. Civic input is exactly how you develop more responsible ethical systems. Otherwise, I don't know how you develop them if you don't everyone take everyone's feedback into developing these big systems. Awesome. So I want to take something on a very practical note, because now these episodes are largely designed for board members, regulators, and policymakers to make tangible decisions. I want to understand from you, if you walk into a room full of, say, suppose a risk committee, or maybe full board sitting in there, and the board chair asks you, Luciana, what are 2 or 3 risk vectors that you see are not being addressed by companies, academia right now, in your view? Which are 2 or 3 risk vectors we should be extremely careful about? AI risk vector, I would say, that we
Yeah.
should immediately address. And we can ask our audit committee to make sure that they have audits in place to address those. What would those 2 or 3 risk vectors be? I mean, what are those blind spots?
Yeah. That's a very powerful question. And I would say that when I look across industries, I see major risk vectors that many companies are still not addressing adequately. And I would say that one of them is the cultural and psychological aspect. Most of organizations focus on technical accuracy, as I mentioned. They focus on legal compliance. That's a huge aspect of their AI governance. I feel like they underestimate how employees and customers experience AI. That's why my research focuses a lot on consumer perspective, on employees, because if workers feel monitored, for example, unfairly by algorithms, or if customers sense that a chatbot so-called empathy is fake, then the reputational and motivational damage can be far greater than the technical errors themselves. So I think that research in organizational psychology is very important because it shows that perception of fairness, for example, and decency often matter more for legitimacy than outcomes. Yet very few companies are measuring these perceptions systematically. So one aspect or major risk factor that is overlooked is the cultural and psychological risk. And then, as I mentioned, vendor and supply chain risk. Again, we tend to assume that AI tools come from trusted vendors and liability is outsourced alone. And in reality, regulators um, basically have been very clear. The deployer remains accountable. So again, if you buy the tool, apply it to sensitive context, uh, like hiring or credit approval, but make sure that it's not biased, it doesn't lead to discrimination. So make sure that everything is very ethical. And what else? We are generally very good at testing AI for immediate errors, but we often tend to ignore how models drift or interact across time. So, for example, recruitment algorithms may look neutral in year one, but then drift towards bias as labor market conditions change. Or, like, for example, multiple AI systems like productivity monitoring or scheduling, they may interact in ways that cumulatively create discriminatory outcomes, even if each system looks compliant on its own. I don't know if that makes sense, but boards rarely see this systemic picture, and most companies don't yet have monitoring or processes robust enough to catch policies there or gaps. So I think this, um, of course, there are many other emerging blind spots. Like, for example, many companies do not know exactly. It was very interesting from experience by consulting a company where the company was not really aware of the AI systems in uh, in place in the company itself. And then when we start looking, oh, but you're using this application as well, and you're using this as well.
Right.
This is also like algorithm based, and this is also AI driven or AI powered. These are like we didn't realize that. We didn't realize that it is also AI. You don't have a strong monitoring system where you know exactly who's using AI in your company, how it's using it, when, and who's assuring compliance. Then you risk falling right below the standard, and you may risk, of course, legal consequences, legal exposures, and so on. So I think these are some key factors that we need to be aware of and try to mitigate as much as possible.
Right on. Some of the examples you gave are classic examples of AI governance pitfalls, right? You can't outsource audit. You can't outsource change management. You can't outsource trust, right? And that's what people are doing. They're outsourcing change management adoption. They're outsourcing audit of these systems. They're outsourcing shadow IT. You brought up a good one in the last point that you mentioned. A lot of companies have systems in place and they don't even know who is accountable for them, who is compliant for them, and how did those systems actually end up in their companies. If you don't have AI governance, this is actually what happens, and you are exposing yourself to a lot of legal risk, reputational damage, brand damage, and penalties. So thanks for sharing that. These are some concrete ones. I really love the ones that you shared. So we are at the tail end of our episode. I just want to end on a lighter one. I know we are having this conversation at the backdrop of tariffs and regulatory regime changes in America. And because 6 months back, the guidelines from the White House was completely different. We were governance and ethics first, and we had multiple executive orders, White House Bill of Rights, and a couple of other guidelines coming out of the White House in the last administration. Now we completely see a change of tone. And with AI action plan, it's more about innovation and export controls rather than the governance. So what in this backdrop, and Europe still, Europe is going full force ahead with implementation of EU AI Act, right? The penalty aspect that you mentioned, the 35 million euros aspect, it actually kicked on 1st of August. So with that in mind, what is one thing that American system can adopt from EU system right now from a governance standpoint. If you have to give a takeaway, of course, no one is really listening, but if they do, what can a US system take one thing out of the European Union, and maybe one thing European Union can take out of the American system? Approach to regulation is very different. Approach to compliance is very different. Approach to privacy is very different. So what is one thing we can take away from each other?
I think the US has a really strong technical capabilities and guiding AI guiding framework. But the thing that I feel it lacks a little bit is a structure, and that strong private public-private mechanism, which can be developed even further. Though we're seeing this amazing progress, this can be developed even further so that it serves our specific needs here in the U.S. In a more appropriate way. So I think this structure and predictability that derives from structure, it's what the EU system brings on a positive side. Of course, as I mentioned, when you're very tight on regulation, if everything is very structured, you can kind of like lose a little bit on the innovation side. You don't have as much flexibility. However, I think because there are so many changes and there are so many things that we need to consider and navigate and so many uncertainties and everything is shifting so rapidly, we need to have these structures so that we can ensure accountability as well. So I think a balance between the EU predictability and structure and a little bit of the US flexibility is actually what will help things.
Well, I hope we take some cues around guardrails from Europe, and Europe takes some cues from us in innovating faster and becoming more flexible and creating some world-class models and AI, which takes the arc of innovation to the next level. So with that, I think we are at the end of time. Thank you so much, Luciana, for your such insights around these nebulous concepts of AI governance, ethics, transparency. We hear them all day long in media as well as in conversations with leaders, but sometimes it just takes someone like you to distill them down with some tangible examples. What does that really mean? And what are the implications if you don't do them right? But you have to tie these very crucial concepts to the language boards, policymakers, and regulators understand, which is the language of ROI, which is the language of legal implications, which is the language of legal exposure, which is the language of civil unrest, which is the language of bias and people not getting the equal opportunity. And each of these constituents have different interest in all these things. So if you can tie these concepts, they can start to make a lot of sense to these folks. So thank you so much for your in-depth insights on these. Look forward to catching up with you again very soon. Thank you so much, Luciana. Have a lovely
Thank
day.
you. I really appreciated our conversation.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.